Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are diving headfirst into some truly extraordinary material. We've got our hands on the primary journals, the original reports, from Dr. David Livingstone's first great expedition. We're talking about that massive trans-African crossing he did between 1840 and 1856.
Right. And this isn't just about, drawing lines on a map or discovering Lake Nami. The real core of these sources, the thing that just leaps off the page, is this incredibly intimate record of a massive ideological clash.
A clash? How so?
It's European Christian theology coming face to face with these ancient, incredibly diverse indigenous belief systems in Central Africa. It's a collision of worlds.
A collision record. I like that. So what we have is this immediate detailed account of what happens when these two ways of seeing the world meet.
Exactly. And we see these moments where the huge existential questions, about God, the supernatural, fate, even what we might call a kind of practical atheism, they just slam up against the absolute life or death realities of survival.
So our mission today is really to unpack these specific high-stakes encounters. We're going to get into the fascinating debate over who actually controls the rain.
Oh, that's a classic.
And the really intricate social mechanics of what gets called superstition, and maybe most powerfully, the devastating psychological toll when a man's entire model of the world just shatters.
And the sources are so unique because it's all in Livingstone's own words. He's got this balance, the cold, objective eye of a scientist mixed with the fiery heart of a missionary.
Which gives us these surprisingly witty, really insightful little nuggets about just universal human nature.
It does. And to really get a grip on that collision that happened out there in the interior of Africa, we first have to understand the man himself, David Livingstone. He was maybe the perfect example of that 19th century attempt to synthesize two things that most people saw as polar opposites.
And that's rigorous science and devout religious faith. Okay, so let's unpack that. Because the sources show this tension started right from the get-go, in his childhood. His passion was, well, it was obvious. What was he reading back then?
Not what you'd expect, not popular novels or anything like that. He was devouring scientific works and books of travels.
So right from the start, there's this relentless drive toward the observable, the verifiable, what you can see and touch and measure.
It is, yeah. And that passion immediately causes friction at home. His father was a very deeply religious man, and he held that sort of common conservative view at the time that scientific works were inimical to religion.
Inimical, so hostile to it. He saw science as a threat.
A direct threat. He believed that investigating physical laws, it eroded the need for absolute faith. It challenged the literal truth of Scripture.
And the sources even mention the kind of books his father wanted him to read instead. Things like Boston's Fourfold State.
Which is about as dense and traditional as you can get. For anyone who hasn't read it, it's all about the four states of humanity: innocence, nature, grace, and eternal glory.
So it's a completely predetermined moral structure. He's being pushed toward this inherited spiritual architecture, but his real passion is for the messy, physical architecture of the world itself.
And that's the key. That's the synthesis. Livingstone never saw it as an either-or. He did the extensive theological training, of course. But his entire professional life, his identity, was built on three pillars: medicine, the healing art, mission work, and geographical discovery.
He was basically trying to prove that science and exploration could be the hands and feet of his faith.
Precisely. The scientific map, the medical kit, for him, these were just pathways to the spiritual lesson.
But wasn't his original plan to go to China? Why the shift to Africa? That seems like a massive change in direction.
It was. China was the original goal, yeah. He was going to use medicine as his way in, but the Opium War was raging, and the mission board basically called it inexpedient. It was just too chaotic.
Impractical.
Right. So the pivot to Africa in 1840, that came through the influence of another missionary, Robert Moffat. But Livingstone's own motivation, it just crystallized very quickly. It wasn't just about converting souls anymore. It was about ending the slave trade.
And that's where his two missions, the geographical and the moral, they just fused together.
Absolutely. He became obsessed with finding a navigable river route, a highway into the interior.
Why a highway?
He believed that if he could open the country up to legitimate commerce, manufactured goods flowing in, raw materials flowing out, It would kill the slave trade at its economic root.
So it's Christianization and civilization happening at the same time, with commerce as the engine.
And that profound moral clarity is what makes him such a good observer. This is where his scientific discipline really pays off for us, looking back at the historical record.
The sources make this really nuanced claim about his impartiality. It says he was not polluted by the racism of his day, but that he was not polluted by the anti-racism of our own. That's a very fine line to walk. What does that actually look like in his journals?
I think it means he managed to avoid the trap, the really common European trap, of seeing indigenous people as inherently inferior. But at the same time, he also avoided the modern trap of, romanticizing them, of ignoring some of the harsh realities and cruelties that he saw with his own eyes.
So he just states things as he sees them?
He tries to. And you see that same rigor when he talks about his own field, about medicine. He's critiquing the European understanding of malaria, even as he's suffering terribly from it himself.
So he recognizes that his own science, European science, is flawed. It's not the absolute truth.
Right. And that willingness to critique his own world is what gives so much credibility to his observations of the African world.
Okay, but hang on a second. You're saying he's impartial, but his entire reason for being there is cultural replacement. He wants to replace their religion, their economy, their social structures with his own. How do we square that with impartiality?
That's the critical tension. You're right. And it's something you just have to hold in your head the whole time you're reading him. His impartiality wasn't moral, it was observational.
Meaning?
Meaning he judged actions, slavery, warfare, things he saw as cruel by this universal moral standard he believed in. But he tried to observe the people themselves with a kind of clear-eyed curiosity. He records their wisdom, their knowledge of the land, without turning it into a caricature. The source even notes he had a fine sense of humor.
Tell me about that. What does his humor tell us about his approach?
It tells us he wasn't just some grim, dour fanatic. He could appreciate the world around him, the beauty, even the absurdity of it. There's a great bit where he describes a Makolo dance as classic.
Classic. That's great.
It's perfect, isn't it? Such a piece of dry wit. He's not endorsing the spiritual meaning of the dance, not at all, but he uses a word we'd use for, a Greek statue to describe the skill of this African performance.
It shows a real human engagement. He's capable of appreciating what he's seeing, even if he's fundamentally opposed to the system that created it.
Exactly. His scientific habit of stating the observable facts acted as a check on his own cultural bias. He respected what he saw, even as his mission demanded he try to change it.
And that internal contradiction just sets the stage for everything that comes next.
It does, because that internal tension within Livingstone gets projected out onto the world as soon as he starts trying to convert people. The journals give us this incredible case study with a chief named Sechel, the leader of the Bakwains.
Right, Sechel. He sounds like a fascinating figure. He's described as highly intelligent. He learns to read incredibly quickly.
Very quickly. And he seems genuinely open to the message, but he also gets the practical problem immediately. He says to Livingstone, "Oh, I wish you had come to this country before I became entangled in the meshes of our customs."
The meshes of our customs.
Okay.
And that wasn't some abstract idea. For him, it meant one thing above all else.
Polygamy. For a chief like Sechel, having multiple wives wasn't just a personal choice, it was the bedrock of his society.
It was politics. It was economics.
It was everything. It was how you built alliances, how you distributed wealth, how you kept social stability. To give that up meant dissolving his own power structure.
And the sources show what happened when he did it. When he converts and gets baptized, he has to provide for all his other wives, give them new clothes, property.
It's a huge political and economic act, a massive divestment of his own status and assets.
And at first, Sechel doesn't quite get why his people aren't on board. Livingstone notes that he thought his tribe ought only to be too happy to embrace Christianity at his command.
He was naive. He saw the spiritual light, but he didn't grasp that for everyone else, this change was deeply, deeply destabilizing. It threatened everything from food security to their own social identity.
And the resistance didn't just come from the elders. It came from the people most directly affected. There's that one incredible anecdote about one of the wives he sent away.
It's just a perfect snapshot of the whole cultural chasm. She gets sent out of the church because she doesn't have the proper gown.
A gown, a symbol of this new foreign idea of modesty.
Right. But she doesn't come back ashamed. She comes back immediately, and the description is just priceless. She has her lips shot out, the very picture of unutterable disgust at his newfangled notions.
Unutterable disgust. I love that. It's so specific. It's not just disagreement, it's a physical display of cultural offense.
She sees this imported morality, this gown, this one-wife rule, as just profoundly ridiculous, offensive to her own dignity.
And in the end, the missionaries feel that their work is so little appreciated.
But they still believe they had sown the good seed. But you have to ask why it was unappreciated. The new religion was demanding this huge social sacrifice for a distant spiritual reward. The old system, their system, offered immediate practical assurances that were tied directly to their existence.
Which brings us right to the moment where this whole debate shifts from abstract morality to pure survival.
The showdown with the rain doctor.
Exactly. The Bachwans are in the middle of a terrible drought. They're desperate. And who do they blame?
They blame Livingstone. They believe he's put some kind of magic spell on their chief, Seychelles, and that's what's stopping the rain rituals from working.
The dialogue that follows is, I think, maybe the richest part of the entire journal. The Rain Doctor gives this incredibly powerful philosophical defense of his tradition.
It's not something you can just dismiss as superstition. He opens with an appeal to tradition, to ancestry. He says, "When we first opened our eyes, we found our forefathers making rain, and we follow in their footsteps."
So he's establishing legitimacy through heritage. This is what we have always done.
But then he immediately pivots to the practical consequences. This is where it gets really serious. He lays out the stakes.
He paints this terrifying picture. If we had no rain, the cattle would have no pasture, the cows give no milk, our children become lean and die, our wives run away, the whole tribe become dispersed and lost, our fire would go out.
That is not a theological argument. That is an argument for the preservation of a people. His role, his theology, is fundamentally about keeping the community alive.
His job is the most essential function in the tribe.
If he fails, the tribe dissolves. And then he levels this direct challenge at Livingstone, who he sees as a fellow professional. He says, "We are both doctors, and doctors are not deceivers."
Wow. So he's putting his rainmaking on the exact same level as Livingstone's medicine,
Yeah.
a necessary life-saving art.
Exactly. So how does Livingstone, the missionary doctor, respond to that? He can't just dismiss it.
He has to defend a concept of God that works on a cosmic scale, a God that isn't just a utility for making rainfall.
And his argument is rooted in what he sees as scientific observation. He accuses the rain doctor of talking about things he has no knowledge of. He says basically that the rain doctors just wait. They watch the sky, they see the clouds forming, they notice the wind changing, and then they do their ritual with the medicine.
So he's accusing them of meteorological opportunism.
Yes. He says they take the credit which belongs to God only. They're just exploiting a natural cycle and claiming they control it.
So you have this classic clash, one faith that demands active, ritual control over nature,
The indigenous system, yes.
and another faith that demands passive observation and prayer to a sovereign, distant God.
And for the Bachwans, a religion that couldn't actively solve the immediate problem of the drought was, frankly, useless. It was a struggle over who had the real knowledge, the effective knowledge, for survival.
Which really gets to the heart of this atheism theme in this specific context. It's not a philosophical denial of a God.
No, not at all.
It's a practical atheism toward a specific God. If Livingstone's God won't deliver the rain, well, they're compelled to go back to the system that has always worked because its methods are known and integrated into their entire way of life.
Absolutely. The success of their religion was measured in full granaries and healthy cattle. The moment the missionary's message failed to produce those physical results, his credibility just vanished, no matter what he promised about eternal salvation.
The failure to make rain was a failure of the Christian God's utility in their world.
And that failure had real long-term consequences for Livingstone's mission in that area. It proved that you just couldn't separate spiritual conversion from ecological and economic reality. And as Livingstone pushed deeper into the interior, he found other belief systems that were maybe less directly confrontational than the rain doctors, but just as challenging to his worldview. His journals reveal this deep cosmology that was rooted directly in the physical world around them, what some might call sacred geography.
Right, the idea that the divine isn't somewhere up in the sky, it's grounded in the immediate landscape.
A specific place.
Exactly, like near Seychelles village, he finds this place, the Cave Lapellel, and it was believed to be the actual habitation of the deity,
A physical address for God.
a physical address. And crucially, it was a place of exclusion. Livingstone, being Livingstone, the curious scientist, he immediately plans an expedition to go and see the god of the Backwains.
Of course he does.
But the old men give him this very chilling, simple warning. They just said that anyone who goes in there, remain there forever. So the divine is accessible, but it's deadly. It demands a certain respect. You don't just barge in.
You don't. And you see that same idea on a much, much grander scale when he reaches the Zambezi Falls, what he would name Victoria Falls. The local name for the massive spray clouds that rise up thousands of feet was Motse Obabarimo,
Which means?
the pestle of the gods. Or sometimes it was just called the abode of deity. It's this visceral, natural response to something of overwhelming power and scale.
It demands a theological explanation.
It does, even for a group like the Makololo, who in other ways were pretty indifferent to the Christian message he was bringing. You can't ignore something like that.
Let's shift a bit to the systems of social control. The journals talk about how in the deep forests among the Balanda people, superstitious feelings were kept alive by these visible markers, idols.
Yeah, and they weren't abstract concepts. They were these physical reminders of a supernatural authority. Often pretty grotesque things like carvings of human heads, lions, or just these crooked sticks placed near villages.
And there's also a mention that the Balanda chiefs feared the medical knowledge of the weak. What's that about?
It seems to indicate a belief that any kind of power, even the power to heal, was a potentially dangerous spiritual force. It had to be controlled by those already in power.
But the most potent and frankly alarming example of this fusion of fear and law has to be the ordeal test.
Terrifying. A summary procedure designed to maintain social order through absolute fear.
And terrifying in its simplicity.
It is. The accused is given an emetic, which is basically a poison, and the judgment is swift and, well, absolute. If you vomit the poison up, your body has rejected it, which proves your spiritual purity. You're innocent.
But if you don't,
If you purge or if you die, you are guilty, and sometimes the bodies were burned immediately.
it's a dark kind of genius, though. It completely bypasses the need for a messy human justice system. No witnesses, no lawyers, no appeals.
It relies on the absolute terror of a metaphysical judgment. The physical result, vomiting or dying, is presented as divine proof. Social compliance is maintained through fear.
And this kind of belief system, it didn't just apply to humans. It extended into the natural world.
Right. Among the Batoka people, Livingstone records this belief in animal metamorphosis. Specifically, that the souls of their chiefs enter into them, particularly into lions.
The souls of chiefs enter lions. And the consequence of that belief is profound.
It is. They never attempt to kill lions.
Yeah.
Now think about that. That's a huge economic and survival decision that is dictated entirely by theology.
You're giving up a source of protection, or at least removing a major predator because of a spiritual connection to your ancestors.
It just shows how completely integrated their belief system was into their daily practical lives.
And for Livingstone, who's trying to preach this very linear, rational theology of sin and salvation and a final judgment, these diffuse, immediate spiritual practices must have been incredibly difficult to even get a handle on.
Almost impossible to penetrate. And that really explains the reaction he gets from the Makololo when he tries to teach them the gospel.
That famous reaction, he called it the most perplexing indifference. What do they mean when they would just reply, "But we don't know," or "We do not understand"? Was it genuine confusion, or was it just disinterest?
Livingstone's conclusion was that their thoughts were just overwhelmingly directed to one thing: the supply of their bodily wants.
So they weren't thinking about eternal damnation or the Holy Trinity. They were thinking about whether they were going to eat tomorrow.
Or whether the cattle would survive the tsetse fly, or if a neighboring tribe was about to attack. This abstract, future-oriented theology just had no weight compared to the immediate material pressures of survival.
So their indifference wasn't philosophical atheism. It was spiritual utilitarianism.
Exactly. If your message doesn't help me find food or stop my children from dying, it's just irrelevant noise.
And that ability to prioritize the physical world, to be indifferent to these abstract ideas, is what makes the end of Sekwebu's story so incredibly shocking.
It is profoundly shocking. Sekwebu was one of Livingstone's most loyal Makolo guides. He made it all the way. He completed the crossing and reached the coast at Luanda.
So after surviving everything the interior could throw at him, disease, hostile tribes, starvation, he encounters the sea for the first time, and it breaks him.
It completely breaks him. The sources say he went into a state of mania
Why?
Because the ocean represented a complete, terrifying, infinite unknown. Sakwebu's worldview, like many indigenous cosmologies, was geographically bounded. The world had an edge, a known limit.
And seeing the Atlantic Ocean just shattered that mental map.
Completely. His own words are just chilling. He said, "The world has no end, but all at once the world said to us, 'I am finished. There is no more of me.'"
Wow, I am finished, there is no more of me. That's the ultimate existential crisis, the moment you realize the very boundaries of your reality are false.
He was completely unmoored, geographically and metaphysically, and a short time later he declared that he was being called away by the gods, and he drowned himself in the ocean.
That's just devastating.
It is. Sakwebu's fate is, in a way, the ultimate price of discovery. Livingstone opened up the physical world, but in doing so, he exposed his guide to a metaphysical terror that proved fatal. The sheer scale of this new world was incompatible with his guide's internal world.
So the psychological boundary broke Sekwebu. But Livingstone was also finding that the physical boundaries, the biological and economic ones, were just as unforgiving.
Yes, Kwebu's tragedy is the emotional climax of that journey, but Livingstone's practical mission had to continue. He was driven by this need to find a functional route to the coast, one that wasn't dominated by the slave trade.
And his determination really hardened after the Boers attacked his mission station at Kolobeng. He said, "The Boers resolved to shut up the interior, and I determined to open the country."
That was it. That geographical imperative became his life's work. And to do it, he had to prove that legitimate commerce was possible, to create a system of mutual dependence that would finally kill the slave economy.
And what's so fascinating is how often indigenous knowledge was the key to his success.
It was far superior. Take the discovery of Lake Ngami back in 1849. The local people had been pointing out its location correctly for 50 years. And the European expeditions kept failing. They kept failing because they were relying on their own faulty maps and trying to cross the desert. The local people had the actual practical knowledge of how to navigate their own land.
But the biggest obstacle to the kind of trade Livingstone was dreaming of wasn't a desert or a bad map. It was something tiny.
Something relentless, the tsetse fly, Glossina moritans, the invisible gatekeeper of the continent.
Livingstone describes it so meticulously in his journals. A brown insect, about the size of a housefly, with these 3 or 4 yellow bars on it.
He called it an insuperable barrier. And it was.
For a human, the bite was just a little itch. But for cattle, for horses, for dogs, it was a death sentence.
The fly transmitted what we now know as trypanosomiasis, and it basically destroyed the main engines of 19th century transport, agriculture, and warfare.
Think about that. This one tiny insect dictated everything. It determined where people could live, what they could farm.
And how they could fight. If you can't keep horses or oxen, you can't have cavalry, you can't plow large fields efficiently, you can't transport goods easily. It's why huge areas of the continent had such low population densities.
And the sources point out this weird mystery about it. They noticed that dogs would die, but calves seemed to be immune so long as they continued sucking milk from their mothers.
Right, which led them down the wrong path for a while. They thought maybe it wasn't the fly itself, but some toxic plant the adult animals were eating.
It wasn't until a Major Varden rode his horse into a fly-infested area for just a few minutes, and the horse died 10 days later, that they proved it was the fly itself.
It was a biological reality that just completely humbled European science and dictated the absolute limits of their access.
So because he couldn't use animals, Livingstone had to rely on human porters, which forced him onto paths that were far away from the established coastal trade routes.
He deliberately chose a route to avoid the path once trodden by slave traders. But the economic poison of the slave trade had already seeped deep into the interior.
You see this when he runs into tribes like the Chibok and the Bushinje. They'd learned a completely perverse kind of economics from the slavers.
They didn't practice barter in the way you might expect. They just demanded payment for passage. A man, an ox, a gun, powder, cloth, or a shell. It was just extortion.
Why? Where does that come from?
They learned it from the slave traders. The slavers, who were desperate to move their human cargo quickly and safely, were willing to pay absolutely exorbitant fees and bribes to local chiefs for safe passage.
So that created an expectation of extortion. It just contaminated the whole economic landscape before legitimate traders like Livingstone even got there.
It did. So when Livingstone's Muckalo companions finally get to the Portuguese settlements and try to trade for themselves, they just get fleeced.
Right. They were charged 90 pounds of ivory for a secondhand musket casket that was probably worth 10 shillings.
It's insane price gouging. It just shows a completely broken system. They immediately, and rightly, distrusted the European traders and their tools like the steelyards for weighing goods. They just assumed it was another trick to cheat them.
So Livingstone's dream of creating this system of mutual dependence through fair trade was being sabotaged at every turn by the legacy of the slave economy.
It had taught everyone to see Europeans as either predators or suckers.
So after all that, the fever, the hostile tribes, the tsetse fly, the existential horror that killed Sekwebu, they finally make it. They reach the coast. Lawanda,
Okay.
how did the Makolo react to seeing European civilization for the first time?
Their reactions are just priceless. They give us this incredible, unfiltered view of a 19th century port city. Remember, they'd never seen a building taller than a single-story hut, so they called the stone houses mountains with caves in them. They literally couldn't conceive of a multi-story building.
Mountains with caves, that's fantastic.
It is. And they noted how polite the Portuguese officers were, which was such a stark contrast to the aggressive border tribes they just dealt with. They recognized and valued civility.
And they actually started to participate in this new world, didn't they?
They did, for a short time. They got jobs unloading coal ships and collecting firewood for what they call a magnificent wage of 6 pence a day. They were experiencing a whole new kind of labor, one that wasn't tied to immediate day-to-day survival.
But the real measure of their transformation, I think, comes in how they saw themselves when they returned.
Yes. They'd endured this monumental journey. They had literally seen the end of their world and survived. They didn't go back as subjects or as mere porters.
They went back as changed men.
They did. Their final declaration was, "We are the true ancients who can tell wonderful things."
The true ancients. They recognized that they now possessed a kind of knowledge, a dignity that was earned through experience, that no one else in their community could possibly match. They are now the authorities on what lay beyond the horizon. This entire deep dive into Livingstone's first journey, it really shows us that his expedition was so much more than just drawing lines on a map. It was this complex negotiation between the physical and the metaphysical, a place where huge theological debates were often just practical arguments about who controlled the resources you needed to live.
We've really seen the profound impact of faith, haven't we? Whether it was the scientifically minded conviction of the missionary or the deeply utilitarian life or death pragmatism of the rain doctor. His belief system wasn't abstract. It was integral to the health of the cattle, the stability of the family, the very survival of his people.
And the lasting nugget of knowledge for you, the listener, really comes from Livingstone's own final summary of the people he met. He concluded that they were just such a strange mixture of good and evil as men are everywhere else, and that they performed actions that were remarkably good and others that were strangely the opposite, with motives that were often just difficult to ascertain.
And that's such a powerful statement for its time. It's a recognition of a universal human nature, regardless of whether you're governed by the Bible or the rain doctor or the fear of an ancestor spirit in a lion. It completely challenged the simplistic European ideas of savage versus civilized.
And that universality leaves us with one final provocative thought, and this comes directly from the sources. Livingstone records that the Makololo had a tradition, a story that sounds a lot like the biblical Tower of Babel, a story about building a high place to the heavens. But in the Makololo version, the story ends with the people being given darkness. So if their own ancestral knowledge contained these echoes of our most ancient narratives, yet their constant practical response to his new theology was always that unsettling "we do not understand." What deep, non-transferable understanding of the world, what precious knowledge of the interior did they possess that they simply refused to share with the inquisitive white doctor?
What knowledge did they hold that they knew was only useful in that darkness and would lose all its power if it was dragged into the light of European inquiry?
That's something to mull over. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.